Today on the Roundhouse, we are talking to someone who has been at the helm of not just one, but two major North American railroads. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 95 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking to Wick Moorman, the former CEO of Norfolk Southern, former CEO of Amtrak, a man with a very legendary railroading career. In fact, we had to take this episode and make it into two parts. This part, we will be talking about Wick's tenure at Norfolk Southern, how he saw the company through the financial crisis of 2008, the heritage units, 21st century steam. We take questions that you guys submitted through social media. It was an amazing conversation, and I want to thank you, the listeners, for helping to make that possible, helping the show to grow. So thank you very much for that. Also, for voting in the Select the Guests competition. For episode 100, we are bringing back 4 previous guests on the podcast. We're bringing them in for a panel discussion. Those 4 panelists will be from the Strasburg Railroad, Andrea Biesecker; from Amtrak, Mike Hune; from Juniata Terminal, Bennett Levin; and from Steam Operations Corporation and Fire Up 611, Scott Lindsay. We'll be taking your questions through social media. Also, feel free to shoot me a line through theroundhousepodcast.com. Last, I want to thank today's sponsor for the Roundhouse, and that is, fittingly enough, Age of Steam Roundhouse. You can visit their site. They are open for the 2020 season. They are doing tours, and check out what they've got going on at ageofsteamroundhouse.org. Our guest today needs no introduction. You know this guy. He is the retired president and CEO of Norfolk Southern, also CEO of Amtrak. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Wick Moorman.
Thank you.
So glad to have you on the show today, Wick. Let's start from the beginning. You grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And from what I've seen, you have a nice train station there. Is that a place that you spent a considerable amount of time when you were young?
I don't know that I'd call it considerable, but every so often I would get my parents to just take me down to this train station. And they'd go off and do something, and I'd hang out for a couple hours. And then I guess when I got a driver's license, I would do that too. And of course, the train station was a Southern Railway facility, but just south of it, the Illinois Central branch line down to Gulfport, Mississippi, the old Gulfport and Ship Island Railroad crossed. So you'd see something go by down there occasionally, what I've sometimes described as boring black Jeeps, and then you'd see something on the Southern go through, and that was exciting.
So even then you were developing a love of particular railroads based on what you were seeing and what was grabbing your eye?
Yeah, I guess so. I just grew up in a Southern Railway town, and that's the company that I really formed an affinity for very early. I'd actually also, because I lived as a child for a couple of years in England, had a real affinity for the British Railways, and still do. And in fact, the British Railway, because of they held on to steam longer, I still have memories of working steam in England, whereas the Southern Railway put the fires out on its last steam locomotive the year I was born.
Since you got to work your way up through the railroad industry, when you reflect back on that time, which country had a more solid railroad infrastructure in place?
Well, they're very different, right? I mean, the United Kingdom, like the rest of Europe, is passenger-oriented, high-frequency train operations on multiple track main lines, some amount of electrification, and just a completely different world even today than the United States, with the exception of the Northeast Corridor. Whereas, the Southern and the IC, and particularly the railroads in the Southeast where I grew up, were essentially single-track freight railroads with passing sidings and without an enormous number of trains out there. From the standpoint of kind of the quality of infrastructure, I really kind of lived through early in my career and watched it before my career, a real evolution in the U.S. in terms of the quality of infrastructure from the 60s, where really almost every railroad had infrastructure that needed a lot of work, had a lot of deferred maintenance on, and the Southern was fortunately very early in the curve in terms of trying to get that caught up, and then on through today, where really the state of the U.S. freight railroad infrastructure is probably second to none around the world.
Infrastructure's always been in your mind to an extent. You went to Georgia Tech and earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. So when did you decide to make the crossover from studying engineering into business and management?
Well, I'll give you the story, which you can edit as you choose to, as you see fit. I went off to Georgia Tech to be an engineer because everyone had told me that I was good in math and liked math and I liked science and I should be an engineer. I don't really know that I had any idea much of what engineers did. And I went off to Tech as a co-op student, a cooperative education program, which was big then and still is fairly big in a lot of engineering schools, where you work, go to school, work, go to school. At that time, we were the quarter system, so you'd work a quarter, go to school a quarter, work a quarter. And I got to Georgia Tech as part of the co-op program, and they said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, I need a job first, but I've always been interested in railroads. And they said, great, we have a bunch of railroads that come and hire co-ops here. And I got a call a month later or whatever it was, and they said the Southern Railway looking for co-ops. And I had signed up as a mechanical engineer, not because I knew anything about mechanical engineering, but when you hear engineer, you think mechanical engineer. That sounds right. And they were hiring for mechanical department co-ops. I called the guy up, and he said, oh, we just filled that job. And I must have expressed my disappointment because he said, well, come down and talk to me anyway. This time the Southern Railway was at the offices in Spring Street, which Norfolk Southern then was in for a long time as well. And I went down there, and he said, well, we don't have a job for you this next quarter. And I said, well, I really need to work. And he said, hold on a minute. The engineering department, by which he meant the track department, always hires co-ops too. And 15 minutes later, I'd met with him, and I'd agreed to change my major, and I had a co-op job. So that's how I became a civil engineer. And then the pathway, so I worked throughout going to Tech, and when I graduated, there were two paths that you could take. One was into pure civil engineering, track design and things like that, and that's essentially what I'd been doing as a co-op student. Or you could go into their management training program, and the Southern Railway management training program was very highly thought of, and they liked civil engineers. So once I left Georgia Tech, I never really practiced a day of civil engineering. I went straight into the management program. Long story, but that's how it all came about.
You start on the Southern Railway in their maintenance of way department. How did that give you an appreciation for the infrastructure that builds a railroad?
Well, you learn what good looks like, and you learn what kind of effort it takes and what kind of spending it takes to have first-rate infrastructure. And you literally learn it kind of from the ground up. When I started, I went out in a training program, and then I went down as track supervisor in Albany, Georgia. I had 30 miles of quote, end quote, main line, which wasn't that good, and 80 miles of a branch line on which we still had 56 and 58.5-pound rail and were running trains. So I knew exactly what really bad infrastructure looked like and exactly what it took to fix it. And it was just one of those places on the southern, it was old central of Georgia, that they hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. So you learn very, very quickly how important good infrastructure is to the railroad and the amount of effort it takes to get it in the state where you want it to be.
When I was watching some of your previous talks online, Wick, one of the things that stood out is you say that you experienced an early midlife crisis. What does that mean to you, and how did you see yourself through that?
As I say, I went down to Albany, as we say down there, Georgia, as track supervisor. And then I went up to the main line at Greensboro, North Carolina. I met my wife there. We got married. And then I went up, was promoted to assistant division engineer and then division engineer. And after about 3 or 4 assignments, I moved, I think, 7 times in 12 years. We ended up back up in Greensboro with a couple of small children. And I had responsibility for a fair-sized territory. And I just started thinking, for whatever reason, that it might not be a bad idea to go back to school and do an MBA. And long story, tried to do the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and that didn't really work out. And one Sunday morning, we're reading the Greensboro newspaper, which at that time was a big newspaper, like they all were, and had a big, people or living or some kind of section, and it had an article, big article about the Harvard Business School, and the essential message of the article was that if you went to the Harvard Business School, the streets would be paved with gold. And my wife said, if you're really serious, why don't you call these people up, call the dean of admissions up? And I think, to her surprise, I did, and was fortunate enough to be admitted. And so I started to kind of say, semi-facetiously, that this was the product of an early midlife crisis. I was 35 years old. And there was some element of truth in that, because my next promotion at the Southern Railway, whenever it came, I would have been traveling 4 to 5 days a week. And I didn't really want to do that with 2 small children. And there was no room, there wasn't an opportunity to change in the railroad at that time for various reasons. So I started joking about it being an early midlife crisis. And my wife would always look at me and say, well, that's fine, but just remember, you only get one. So I took that to heart, and we went off to Harvard Business School for a couple of years.
What do you think you came away with most strongly from that experience that prepared you for the future ahead?
That's a very interesting question, which I've thought a lot about. I don't think it certainly gave me a much broader business background. Harvard, like some other business schools, but it's probably the leading exponent of this, teaches everything by the case method. So every class you read and prepare for a discussion, it's held by the class, essentially, facilitated by the professor, of something that's going on in a company somewhere, of any kind of company. It could be a personnel issue, it could be a manufacturing issue, it could be anything, depending on the course, strategic issue. And so you certainly leave there with a much greater understanding of business and how business works. You also, and I also say this semi-facetiously, you also come to understand that there are a lot of people that run companies and are in very senior levels of companies that aren't particularly good at what they do, because there's just a lot of cases where somebody is just screwed up. But so it didn't make me any smarter. It certainly gave me a lot more background of business. And the biggest thing it did for me from a career standpoint was that it kind of stamped a ticket for me. It gave me a level of, for want of a better word, notoriety inside the company, because I left. I took a buyout. That's another long story. They happened to have a buyout. I took a buyout, and then they hired me back. And there wasn't anybody else around like me and I've been a good track person. I've been a good DE. There wasn't anyone else like me who had gone off and gotten an MBA at Harvard and then come back to the company. So, and that became very important, because there were a couple of times when they were looking for somebody to do something, and they chose me because they knew me, if that makes sense.
I think we can all relate to being in a position where we're looking to continually improve on the education that we have and be able to show that we want to grow and progress, especially those that work for corporations of some kind in one way or another. What were the greatest tools for you personally, based on either the education you'd received or just things that you learned, that when you look back make it clear, this is what helped me to progress, to get from one step to the next?
Oh, that's a hard one for me to answer. As I said, one of the things that clearly helped me was just the fact that I had done it, and maybe there's some truth to the idea that, as you say, it indicated that I wanted to learn. Right, I was willing to do something, to take a risk in some way, to go off and do this, to improve myself. But when I did it. And my wife, Bonnie, was just extraordinarily supportive. And my mother loved the fact that I was doing it. She was an educator, and she would tell me that all of her friends kept saying, "Oh, he's so brave to do that." And I kept thinking to myself, I don't want to be thought of as brave. I think this is a smart thing to do. And it turned out that it was. But one of the things that I've always been curious, I guess, and wanted to learn. And I've also always kind of understood that I don't know the answers to everything. In fact, I don't know the answers to most things. And so the idea, particularly after I got out of Harvard and started getting put into positions where I really didn't know anything, was that I needed to figure out quickly who the people were around me that really did know answers and were smart people that I could trust to help me, and then ask for their help, which was always freely given. So it's, I kind of look back and I don't really know exactly what it was. It certainly wasn't some secret sauce. I don't feel that I was. I feel that I was very lucky. That's exactly what I think. I have been very fortunate. I'm knocking on wood when I say that, in my career and in my life.
When did you first find out that you were being considered for president, or that you'd been selected? When was the first time that you were contacted about that?
So NS has a mandatory retirement policy for board elected officers. vice presidents and executive vice presidents and the CEO. And David Good, my predecessor, we all knew how old he was, and there was there was a succession process that was held. It was not nearly as organized as succession processes that you see in a lot of companies today, but it was very clear that there was going to be a management change, and it was pretty clear who the candidates were, and I knew that I was a candidate. But the other people who were candidates were people I worked with every day and considered to be friends and still consider to be good friends. So we went through all of this and the pieces of the process. And what happened is one day, must have been after a board meeting, David called me up to his office, and I think he said the bony finger of fate or something like that. It's touching you, and you're going to be the next guy. And he said, but you can't tell anybody about it because it doesn't become official until the next board meeting, which was like 2 months away. I mean, it was I didn't learn, this wasn't announced right away. And he said, and you just can't tell a soul other than Bonnie. And so I literally went home and I waited 2 days before I told her, just to make sure I could keep a secret. And so didn't tell the children, didn't do anything like that. And then it was announced right after the next board meeting. So that's how it happened. David told me. And I will say, I've told a lot of people this, did I aspire to the job? Yes. Did I, I tried very hard to not make it an all-consuming aspiration. And to continue, and Bonnie did too, continue to assure myself, which is true, that if it didn't happen, I'd be fine. And I had seen examples in my life with other people where they wanted something very badly and they didn't get it, and it was devastating. So I didn't want that to happen. But, did I want to be CEO? But sure, right? And the crazy thing was, it's like the instant he told me that, it sobered me up. I thought, oh my God, what on earth am I going to do, right? And it was a very interesting feeling. It was like, my goodness, can I do this? And I was talking to a friend later about this, another person in Norfolk Southern, and he said, I was telling him this, I had this feeling. He said, of course you had this feeling. You realized you had 30,000 mouths to feed. And I said, don't even say that to me. I can't take it. But, and long story again, that's how I found out, and that's what I thought.
Some might envision those as the top of the company as, okay, they got it made, they're set, they made it there. The way you talk about it, you've always had a respect and a groundedness with it. You were coming into this honestly and looking at this for everything it was and really respecting the responsibility that came with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, right? It's a big company, and there are a lot of people out there that are working extremely hard to make it all work, and it takes a lot of people doing a lot of different things well to have a good railroad company. And going back to the very beginning, right, as a track supervisor, right, I understood that. I'd seen that. And I think it's helpful that I started out as a management trainee and a track supervisor back in the days when, and I liked to work. And I mean, I was out driving spikes and tamping off ties and helping throw, this is how long ago this was, helping throw these cross ties out of gondolas to put in a yard somewhere, all that. I have a plenty big ego. Everybody, I won't say without exception, but people who become a CEO they have to have some level of ego. That you have to have some level of confidence in yourself that you're capable of doing the job. But I've always tried not to ever let that get to me, and to never define myself by the job. And I'm blessed in that I have a wife who very capably assisted me in that. I'd come home and say something, and she'd say, "Don't come over as CEO on me." And my children also trying as hard as they could to take the wind out of my sails. And why shouldn't I be approachable? I am just a human being like everybody else. I'm just the same in so many ways. And why wouldn't I be approachable and want to respect and understand and listen to anybody, particularly somebody who works for the railroad, because we were all on the same team.
Do you think that the climate still exists that somebody who in the 21st century is starting their career in track maintenance or engine crew, train crew, has the ability with that luck and skill combination to progress to senior management?
Yeah, I do believe that. I don't think that it's, if you look around the senior management of a lot of companies, right, you'll find people who started out as in some kind of training program, may have not been in operations, and come up through the company. Everybody has to come up through the company somehow, or most people do. I think again, it goes back, I was very lucky. I think the career path I had, from a number of respects, was very unusual. It's not that it would never happen, but it's not going to be very often that it happens.
You became president in 2004. You became CEO of Norfolk Southern in 2005. For people who aren't used to what those titles actually mean, how do you delineate between the two of them as far as corporate leadership?
Well, so the presidency of Norfolk Southern is a transition job, right? And typically you've got a president for a year, something over a year. I was right around a year. But the CEO is still there. And I always used to say that David was the CEO and I was president, and once I became president, David kind of drew up a mental list of all the things that he liked to do and all the things that he didn't like to do but had to be done, and that became the president's list, which was fine. If you look at it kind of on a matter-of-fact basis, there are some substantial number of things where, according to bylaws or according to some regulation or something, the president of the company is responsible, right? So there's a role that someone has to play as president. If you look at the title CEO, that's really what you are. At the end of the day, you're the chief executive officer. You're the senior most executive officer. And then the other role that you can play, which I took on in early 2006, was chairman of the board. And that's its own role as well, because that would interface with the board, although in modern terms, there's a chairman of the board, which can or cannot be the CEO. But if it's the CEO, then there's also an independent lead director, which that person has a lot of authority at the board level too. But that's how I kind of always thought about it. You could, there's no real delineation other than there are things you sign because they have to be signed by the president.
When we return to our conversation with Wick, we'll hear him talk about how he implemented Spirit at Norfolk Southern, as well as the heritage units. Age of Steam Roundhouse, a true treasure of railroad preservation, is back for its second public season. This is a brand new roundhouse with nearly 24 steam locomotives on display in Sugar Creek, Ohio. The facility features an 18-stall, accurately reconstructed brick roundhouse surrounding a 115-foot turntable, the largest private collection of steam locomotives in the world, and a fully functioning, working back shop where skilled staff actively restore and repair steam locomotives. The railroad is open for tours this summer and fall and is taking all necessary precautions to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Tours of the roundhouse and shop area will be offered Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, July through October. Tickets must be purchased in advance on their website at ageofsteamroundhouse.org. If you haven't seen it yet, visit ageofsteamroundhouse.org and follow them on social media. One of the things I've heard you talk about in other places when you came into that role was wanting to examine the culture and implementing something called spirit.
That was an interesting process. Every company, and some companies pay I'd say more attention than others, but everybody pays some attention to this. You have to think at the senior level about the values of the company. What is it that you want the workforce to look at and see as the important values for the company, right? And this actually started as a process where we had an offset. The new senior team and I had an off-site meeting, and this idea of then looking at one of the things that came out of it was this idea of looking at the values of the company, and I think we had some kind of, and if we had a value statement, we may have, but it wasn't something that was clear and coherent and widely known. And so we went through a process, a fairly long process with some focus groups, with management people and other people to start to boil out what are the things that are important to us. And so we came up with this list of values, and safety and performance, integrity, respect for others, and teamwork. And so this is another offhand story. So I was looking at these words today and one day, and I kind of looked at them and I said, what is this? Can we do something with this from a word, spelling it out, making it a word? And we had sprit, and that didn't make any sense. But I had always believed, and this came out of the Southern Railway background, because Southern Railway was very, very strong in promoting this idea of innovation. In fact, if you are a certain age and remember Southern Railway boxcars, they had Southern gives a green light to innovation on the side of them. So I said, well, let's try to drive this core value of innovation as well. And then we had the spirit value: safety, performance, integrity, respect, innovation, and teamwork. And we really started to use them in terms of trying to promote a certain culture at the company and to manage the company by those values, to the point where we started, and it took a while, we started to make a lot of decisions and personnel decisions around looking, not only at who the person was and what they were doing, but how well did they understand and ascribe to these values. And one of the things, and some people took them with a grain of salt, and we weren't perfect at any of them, Lord knows. But one of the things I was very pleased with is we had a culture assessment done after about 6 or 7 or 8 years as part of something else that was going on, and the consultants went out and talked to people all over the railroad about, union folks and management folks. And the one thing they came back and they said, we have never seen anything like it. Everybody knows what the spirit values are. And I think that was important. I think culture is really, really important for the long term. There was a famous management consultant named Peter Drucker who said, culture trumps strategy every time. So, that's something I try to pay a lot of attention to.
You absolutely needed a good team, especially considering that one of the great challenges that you had to oversee during your tenure was, of course, the Great Recession of the late 2000s. I saw a talk that you were delivering in 2009 where you were talking about how it wasn't just affecting pieces of cargo that you might expect to go down, but even things like energy. What carried you through that?
We managed through it okay. I'm sure we didn't get it all right along the way. But we tried to aggressively respond, but take care of as many of our employees as we could. So we tried to do things where we had arrangements where we paid people's benefits if they would agree to be on call for some number of days a month and things like that. So, because we just we had been on like other companies, we've been on a big hiring and training program for a while to get through this demographic bulge we had of so many people over the age of 50. And so, you just manage through it. It's all you can do. And of course, the interesting thing about that was from a car loading standpoint, that was the after effects in a lot of the financial community lingered for a while, but from a carload aspect, it bounced back pretty quickly. Bounced back more quickly than we anticipated. But that's just part of the deal. You're not going to have it all run smoothly for you. So we got through it.
What would you say was one of the greatest business triumphs that you were proud to take part in during your time?
Somebody else would have to answer that. I tend to look back and see the things that I didn't do. What am I happy about? Let me answer it slightly differently. I was there by and large. We had the downturn in 2008, 2009, but for the most part, business was good. We were making money. Going back to your kind of original question about infrastructure, we invested a lot of money in infrastructure. We built a lot of infrastructure to support our intermodal business because I believe, as I still do, that, and it's coming on even more strongly now with the demise of coal, that, that's where the growth has to be. So we built terminals, we added track capacity, we cleared up a lot of pinch points on the railroad in terms of capacity. We started, and other people have copied it, some very innovative things in terms of programs like locomotive rebuilds. I think we invested a lot of money and invested it for the most part very wisely in the railroad, and I left it better than it was when I got there, and I'm very happy about that. Big business triumphs, I can't think of any.
Scott Locker asks, how do you foresee the railroad industry panning over the next several years? Will coal traffic completely die out as a source of revenue?
Well, I don't know what the time period is, but the answer is yes. Coal's decline. Other than met coal, metallurgical coal will still be around, but steam coal, thermal coal, people are going to stop burning coal in this country, and they're going to stop it sooner rather than later. And there are people who try to blame that on regulation and the like, and it may not be helpful, but what's killing coal generation is cheap natural gas, and pressure on climate. And there's no question that pressure is going to continue. So where do I see I think the railroad business right now has been for the past 3 years or whatever, going through a really significant transition with this advent of this so-called precision scheduled railroading. A really, really all-consuming focus on operating ratio. And what at least appears in some companies to be much less of an interest in growth, and rather than just squeezing the operating ratio down and producing as much cash as you can. I don't know where that all ends. I have no idea. I don't think the industry can continue to not worry about growth for a sustained period of time. But how that all ends, I don't know.
Precision scheduled railroading is certainly a very hot topic these days, as you see it come into conversation with pretty much all of the Class 1s. If you were at Norfolk Southern, either now or precision scheduled railroading had been a thing during your tenure, would you have chosen to implement it in some regard, or would you have tried to resist against that?
That's a good. Let me say that there are things about precision scheduled railroading that are fine, that make good sense. Hunter Harrison, whom I knew fairly well and liked a lot, was in some very real ways an operating genius. And so things like kind of this refocus, and I kind of look back and think, okay, we could have done some of this stuff and should have, but things like, focusing on things like block swapping, stop switching cars so much, try and streamline the operations, combining traffic, right? The idea that, you move mixed traffic. You don't worry about differentiating on service. It's not that there's not goodness in it, right? I think what I worry about is, along with it comes a really, I don't even know the right word, a really significant effort on getting rid of people, and not just train crews, but all kinds of people, reducing headcount everywhere. Let me say this. There's a lot of pressure on railroad CEOs and management teams these days to do this. And the general feeling is, and it comes from, the big shareholders. And their general feeling is, if you won't do it, we'll go out and find a management team who will. And when you're under that kind of pressure, you have to do things. I can tell you, it's not an environment I would have been very happy in, but I'm not in it. So I look at it from afar. It's not all bad, but they're just things that I don't necessarily think are very good.
One way in which people could tell, certainly rail fans could tell, that your presidency was going to be one of having a strong public-facing image, even from an early stage, was when Norfolk Southern acquired 4 F-unit Streamliner locomotives and assembled its office car special. What was your role and vision behind that train set?
Yeah, we always had the office cars. Right. I mean, they've been running inspection trips in the summer forever. We entertained customers on the office cars. We had all of them, and we actually ran trips with the things. And I guess, how did I start dancing? Anyway, somehow came up. I think Kansas City Southern. I think Mike Haverty had bought some Fs and painted them in KCS colors. Did he do that before? I think maybe he did. Anyway, I said something that, we ought to think about some kind of special locomotives for our office car train to Steve Tobias, who was our chief operating officer, and he comes back a couple of weeks later and said, well, we found some F units for you, and they weren't expensive. And so we bought them, and then the thing I had a significant hand in, other than saying I thought it would be a good idea, was I knew the paint scheme I wanted, which was the Southern Railway old tuxedo scheme. And of course, the crazy thing about that is when we painted them, they were black and white, and they wasn't gold. It was a yellow striping around it, which was not quite the Southern, but was close. But at various times, it was mistaken for Pittsburgh Steeler colors and Georgia Tech colors. And I was happy about the Georgia Tech, but the Pittsburgh Steelers I just didn't see. Anyway, I thought they were great looking locomotives, and when we went around the railroad with the inspection train, we got a really positive response. We got a positive response from our employees and from non-employees, including people who weren't rail fans, who just came up and said, boy, those are gorgeous. And they were.
So those travel the rails for several years, and then come along the big one, the heritage units. How did that idea unfold?
Who painted the first? I guess UP had half a dozen kind of semi-heritage units, or somebody had some heritage units and out there, and so I'd get letters, and people would say, when are you going to have some heritage units? And I kept saying, well, the F units are the heritage units, so leave me alone. And so we were coming up in 2012 on the 30th anniversary of the formation of Norfolk Southern. And a gentleman in Roanoke, whose name eludes me, but he would do line drawings of locomotives. Andy's last name. Andy Fletcher. So I get this poster in the mail, which he printed up, kind of small poster, with like 20 heritage units on it, NS heritage units, and suggesting that we do that for the anniversary. And so I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting, good idea. And I went down to see Mark Mannion, our chief operating officer. I said, what do you think? He said, I think that looks really good. Let's do it. And it just so happened that we were getting a bunch of new locomotives in, literally getting them in over the next few months. And so we decided to paint them, and we changed. We went down the list, and there were, I forget which ones, there were a couple of the ones Andy suggested. I think he maybe had a New Haven unit or something. I've forgotten any, where we said, no, that's not really one we want to do. And then we added 2 or 3. We had some discussion, interestingly enough, about should we do a Penn Central unit. And we decided to, because it was a heritage, right? Heritage locomotive. And we had an interesting response. So we got them delivered in primer gray, and we were getting locomotives at the time. We had an order with GE and EMD, and GE said, fine, we'll ship them to you in primer. And EMD got excited about the project because they had painted all these, just about every heritage scheme we came up with. EMD had painted a diesel in that scheme, right? And they said, we'll paint them for you. Great, without charging you anything extra, I think. And we said, that's great. And so then we had people set out, and they did all this research on original colors just to kind of make sure. And EMD was very useful because they had so many of the files still on what they painted them. And we started painting these things and rolling them out, and they got a great response. I mean, they got a great response from the railroad community and our employees. And for our employees, a lot of them, it was kind of like a history lesson. They didn't know anything about these predecessor companies, and they'd see this go by and they, oh, what's that? You know, it was. Well, we were very pleased with how that worked out. Thought the locomotives looked great. You know, they were, and as you know, I'm sure their websites that track them. And, people have produced models of all of them. It's been a very good thing. I thought it was a positive. You know, all of this stuff, the F units, the heritage fleet, and I'm sure you will want to ask about this, the steam program, bringing back some steam. I just viewed as very positive things that we could do to enhance the image of the community, of the company in the community, not just the rail fan community, but the broader community, as well as, you know, be something for our employees to take some pleasure and pride in as well.
Once they were complete, in 2012, Norfolk Southern worked with the North Carolina Museum of Transportation in Spencer, North Carolina, to host a gathering. And there's a very well-known photo by your photographer, Casey Thomason, of all 20 locomotives lined up around a roundhouse. I had the pleasure of going to that event, and I know that you did as well. What were some of the conversations that you had with people there? What was your reaction to the response and seeing all of these in one place at one time?
Well, the story behind that is that somebody approached me and said, essentially, are you going to get them all together? And we thought about it, and I thought, well, we can do it, but we're only going to do it once, right? We're not going to drag these things from all parts of the railroad to get them together. And so then we started thinking about, well, where would we do that? And the suggestion that came out from our folks was Lambert's Point. And I thought, nah. And I said, and I knew about the turntable, the roundhouse at Spencer. I said, what about Spencer? I said, well, let's just see if we can do it at Spencer, at the museum, and called them up. Of course, they were delighted. And we assembled them all down there, and I went down for a little while. And it was great. It was absolutely great. They looked stunning. And I have that picture you referred to, a picture taken by Casey up in a helicopter, I guess. And he signed it, and I signed it, and Andy Fletcher had signed. So, it was a wonderful event. And, of course, you know, Spencer made a lot of money out of it, which was good. It was great for the museum, and then that led them to start thinking, and then that eventually culminated in the Streamliners event, a couple of years later, whenever it was.
The Streamliners event was something that, in hindsight, I wish I'd attended because everybody tells me I should have, but a phenomenal thing because there Norfolk Southern is as a partner, and it isn't specifically about your heritage and heritage railroads, because you had F units that were representing either direct competitors or predecessors of competitors. What was the value that you saw in working with all of the different organizations to make that happen?
I thought we did that more for the benefit of the museum. I mean, we were happy to do it, and a bunch of our people went to it and enjoyed it. But we did that for the benefit of the museum. They did most of the legwork and contacting people and getting them to bring E's and F's. And the people were really good, UP sent an E unit. all kinds of people contributed, and I think every unit that moved, whichever railroads moved it, moved them back and forth for free. And it was an equal event. I was trying to remember. I think that's the one where, was it the streamline? You didn't know the streamliner. One of them was just boiling hot. That's streamliners of the Heritage unit.
I think that was Heritage units. Maybe they were both hot, but I remember the Heritage unit event being the dead of July, super hot.
Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, streamliners was and the streamliners were really cool. It's the only place I've ever seen a PA, right? Because Doyle McCormick got his PA, which he's been working on out in the Pacific Northwest, I guess, made it all the way to Spencer.
You mentioned this earlier, and this is a big one in people's minds. Brian Dembinski asks, could you provide a retrospective of the 21st Century Steam Program?
So the Southern Railway, then NS Steam Program, David Good canceled it when he became CEO. And I think you can argue back and forth about canceling it completely, but the fact of the matter was it was tired and it was consuming a lot of people's time across the railroad because we ran a lot of trips. But the time moved along, and I just thought, one of the things I believed in very strongly, I still believe in and do, is support the museums, the institutions, which are important to our heritage. So, you could pick them, TVRM and Altoona and Spencer, and the folks with the Nickel Plate Society, and on and on and on. We ought to help these people because they've got our stuff. And it started with and the two, really, I think it started with 4501, which was coming up on his 100th birthday down at TVRM. And then we had the J, which is just obviously iconic. And so we stepped in and helped both of them get back in steam. And my idea, which I think was the appropriate way to do it, is run a very limited program and really focus on employees and families and giving them a chance to ride the train. And that really came out of a conversation I had with a conductor up somewhere on the CNO and TP, talking about the fact that his family had no idea what he really did, what it was like. And we had actually started taking craft employees on our we've done inspection trips and take outstanding employee, conductor, or machinist, or whatever. We take them for a ride and, talk about the railroad, let them see the railroad, and feed them lunch. And I guess it was one of those things. He talked about that, and I thought, we just need to have something else for our employees. And it really, I think, again, worked out very well for us from a public perception standpoint. I will never forget. They did a lot of the work, I guess about all of the work, to put 611 back down at Spencer in the Roundhouse. And we ran a special to take, when it was ready, to take 611 back to Roanoke, and I rode that. And the crowd from Spencer, North Carolina, to all the way to Roanoke were just unbelievable. Every town with people, every bridge with people on it. I mean, I don't know, it was 100, 200,000 people. However many were out there, a lot of people. And they weren't all rail fans, by any means. But here they saw Norfolk Southern and saw it in a very positive light, right? Not just the company that's blocking your crossings for you, but doing something to kind of recapture a better feeling, a positive image about the railroad. And I thought that was a good thing, and we didn't overdo it. And I thought it was a positive program.
It seems like there's a theme where to address some of these modern issues or points that could be improved on, that part of your approach has been to look to the past for solutions. When you talk about previously how with this idea of Spirit coming out of Southern Railway's own employee initiatives and own internal PR, and then this is a way of recognizing your employees and getting them and their families more educated. Was that something that you were conscious of, that because you have this love of history, and particularly railroading history, that is something that you drew inspiration from to find solutions to modern challenges?
Yeah, I'm sure it was in a way. But you also look to the past sometimes to see what's worked, where the good ideas are, and good ideas that are specific to your industry, right? I mean, and part of that's clearly driven by the fact that I have an appreciation for the technology and the history. But I think a lot of people do. I think I've always believed that there is, if you can tap it, there is an innate feeling of goodwill towards the railroad industry on the part of a lot of people in this country because of this history and because of the fact that, if you look back 2 generations, most people had somebody in the family that worked for the railroad. And we might as well try to take advantage of that. It just makes sense to do that. So that's what I did.
David Flores asks, do modern operations with preserved and heritage equipment have a future in today's modern railroads?
I do not know. I just don't know how that all plays out. I think one of the issues now is PTC, right? How will there ultimately be some kind of way to have a waiver for running a steam engine that's not PTC equipped? It's doable, but that depends on the FRA. The answer is, I think that if there's one company that really has done some extraordinary things, and I think will continue to do them, that's UP.
In part 2 of this episode, which will be coming out shortly, we'll hear Wick talk about his time at Amtrak and Norfolk Southern. Stay tuned and follow us at theroundhousepodcast.com.
And now, the question of the day.
Your question of the day for this episode is, what did you enjoy most about Wick Moorman's tenure as Norfolk Southern CEO, either as a fan or as an employee of the company? Let me know on theroundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Stay tuned for part 2 of this conversation when we talk to Wick about his time at Amtrak, the East Broad Top Railroad, and what he's excited for about that, and so much more. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.